The Mars Medical Outpost K-9 hung like a steel pearl above the dust-choked canyon of Vias Marineris, rotating steadily against the faint, rust-colored glow of the planet below. From orbit, the Martian landscape looked deceptively calm, a barren quilt of ancient fissures and jagged shadows. But under its surface, accidents were as common as dust storms. Mars was still a frontier, and frontiers had a way of chewing up the fragile. Inside the medical outpost, sterile light filled the corridors. Gravity hovered just shy of Earth norm, light enough to feel like a dream, heavy enough to make a misstep meaningful. Machines hummed, monitors pulsed, and artificial air carried the faint trace of antiseptic and metal. In one of the isolation chambers at the far end of the long, curved ward, a new patient had arrived, classified under Emergency Retrieval, Trauma Priority 1. Lieutenant Jason Hale, Earth Defense Corps, had been recovered from a collapsed terraforming control shaft near the western ridge of Olympus Station. A routine recalibration had gone sideways after a seismic tremor disrupted the foundation supports. He had been trapped under twisted alloy struts for 4 hours before the auto beacon finally pinged. When the drone team pulled him free, he was barely conscious, vitals flickering, breathing ragged through a half-ruptured filtration mask. His blood oxygen levels were dangerously low, internal temperature dropping, and muscular strain indicated a high probability of crush injury to the lower torso and thighs. Assigned to his case was Nurse Solari of the Varelian branch, one of the many species working under the Interplanetary Health Accord. Trained on IO and cross-certified for human biology, she had memorized every human anatomical diagram in the medical database. But diagrams and reality often diverged in practice. She entered the chamber like a wisp of light, her skin softly aglow with the pale blue shimmer of her people's bioluminescence. Her uniform, sterile white with silver trim, conformed neatly to her tall, lean frame, its texture adjusting to the room's temperature. Her large eyes, framed by faint ridges of nacreous scales, scanned the patient from foot to crown. He lay motionless in the recovery pod, the upper half of his uniform already removed by the triage bot, his chest rising and falling in shallow intervals. He was warm-blooded, mammalian, and completely unconscious. Solari initiated a standard triage sequence, scans first, then hydration IVs, followed by neurosynaptic stabilization. The machines chirped and hummed as data streamed across the transparent diagnostic display. Pulmonary function was stabilizing. Blood chemistry was rebalancing. Minor cranial trauma. Muscular stress across the hips and thighs. Tissue swelling was flagged near the groin. She took note of it, tagging the region for detailed imaging, assuming blunt force bruising or subdermal rupture. Nothing her training hadn't prepared her for. With practiced movements, she prepared the regrowth gel, a pale, iridescent compound designed to stimulate cell regeneration in soft tissue. She adjusted the pod's environmental controls, lowering the air pressure slightly to promote circulation and elasticity. Then she reached for the antiseptic wipe and applied it to the flagged region. What followed was not in the manual. The tissue, previously flaccid, warm, and unresponsive, began to swell rapidly under her touch. At first, she paused, thinking it was a delayed edema reaction. She activated a secondary scan, expecting to see fluid pooling or muscle tearing. But the diagnostic output showed no internal bleeding, no hematoma, no rupture. Instead, it flagged high levels of adrenaline and a spike in endocrine activity, particularly in the anterior pituitary and hypothalamus. She blinked slowly, eyes narrowing in confusion. Heart rate was climbing. Peripheral blood flow was increasing, specifically to the pelvic region. Thermoregulation was spiking disproportionately. The swelling was no longer medically plausible under injury criteria. It was something else. The patient stirred, barely, but his facial muscles twitched in what might have been an involuntary smile. The swelling increased. The vascular activity intensified. Solari's neural implant buzzed in alert confusion. She'd seen this kind of hormone spike before, usually during mating seasons among her own kind, but never in a human clinical case. A deep, unfamiliar warmth crept into her chest. Her skin's glow shifted, barely perceptibly, from clinical blue to the faintest tinge of violet. She hadn't meant to cause this. It wasn't intentional. She hadn't triggered any mating pheromone protocols, and the room's scent neutralizers were active. Still, the reaction continued, and it was now accompanied by a secondary rise in systemic tension, his entire muscular network bracing for stimulation. She stepped back slightly, checking the filters and reviewing the environmental factors. Nothing had malfunctioned. The patient's body had reacted to physical contact, nothing more. A purely biological, autonomic response. But Solari couldn't help but feel unprepared. This was more than a clinical oversight. It was a gap in cross-species understanding. She tapped the console, logging the event for review, tagging it with the appropriate medical code, inflammatory vascular anomaly, unknown trigger. The machine asked for follow-up data. She hesitated. Her hand lingered on the side of the pod for a moment too long, watching the patient's expression settle into something peaceful, even content, despite his injuries. The artificial light danced across the curve of his chest, and for a flicker of time, she felt something strange spark in her own circulatory rhythms. An echo, a biological resonance, something that no training program had ever mentioned. Perhaps human anatomy was more reactive than the data suggested. Perhaps this was only the beginning. The orbital day cycle aboard Mars Medical Outpost K-9 dimmed subtly, casting the long, sterile corridors into a cooler spectrum of artificial twilight. Outside the observation windows, the Martian horizon remained unchanged, burnt red and lifeless, but within the station, the shift in lighting signaled the beginning of the second rotation cycle, a time reserved for follow-up diagnostics and metabolic recalibration. Nurse Solari stood alone in the observation chamber, reviewing the biofeedback data collected during Lieutenant Jason Hale's initial recovery phase. The readouts remained strange, at least by her standards. The swelling, the heat signature, the hormonal spikes, they defied textbook categorizations. None of the anomalous readings showed pathological patterns, but neither did they conform to expected human biological behavior under post-trauma sedation. The regenerative gel she had applied should have reduced inflammation, not triggered additional vascular responses. His elevated endocrine signals had persisted for nearly an hour, fading only once his body fully stabilized and the sedative balance recalibrated. She had noted all of it. She had reported none of it. Not out of shame, not out of fear, simply out of caution. The Interplanetary Health Accord required full transparency, but it also allowed attending medics the discretion to withhold data flagged as culturally sensitive for further review. And though Solari didn't yet fully understand the biological mechanics behind Hale's response, she knew instinctively that it had been involuntary and not pain-related. Whatever it was, this reaction, it was tied to something else. Something more primal than injury. She moved with silent precision, her bare feet gliding across the warm polymer flooring of the ward. Her skin retained its soft bioluminescence, pale blue once again, though the memory of the violet hue that had shimmered along her arms during the previous shift lingered in her thoughts like a whisper she couldn't quite place. She had not experienced a color shift like that in over a cycle, typically reserved for emotional or instinctual cues. It disturbed her not because of its nature, but because it had occurred unbidden. In the chamber, the patient remained asleep, encased in a transparent bioshell designed for accelerated muscular healing. The pod's systems had stabilized and its atmospheric regulation returned to neutral. His breathing was even. His pulse had normalized. But beneath that calm exterior, Solari knew the deeper metrics told a more nuanced story. His testosterone levels were still higher than baseline. Minor oxytocin fluctuations suggested neural interactions consistent with early bonding indicators. And though his cognitive functions were suppressed by sedation, brief EEG spikes indicated stress dream patterns, vivid, complex neural storms. She initiated a deeper scan, allowing the sensor array to sweep through his abdomen and pelvis with micro-resolution. No signs of rupture, no scarring or abnormal tissue growth. Vascular structures were intact, healthy. In fact, his tissue regeneration was proceeding faster than expected. The only remaining irregularity was what the system labeled localized tension. Again, no inflammation, no damage, just density. Biological readiness. A physiological readiness for what the scanner could not determine, but Solari had a growing suspicion. She stepped away from the console and approached the pod. Her hands moved methodically as she adjusted the stabilizer bands across his thighs and checked for thermal consistency. The surface of his skin was still warm to the touch. Human warmth, so different from Varelian homeostasis. Her own people radiated cold in comparison, internalizing their thermal processes to conserve metabolic energy. Humans were radiant, always exuding subtle heat even at rest. As she applied a new layer of dermal sealant over his healing abrasions, her fingers brushed once more against the site of the earlier reaction. This time, she did not flinch when the response began again. It was slower this time, but unmistakable. Pressure built beneath the skin. Subtle pulses beneath her touch. A rhythm she could not ignore. She withdrew her hand and activated a neuromuscular inhibitor field to prevent further involuntary movement. The machine buzzed briefly, projecting an electromagnetic veil across the pod's lower section. The tissue beneath fell dormant, unresponsive once more. Solari exhaled, her breath catching against her own will, as if her body was beginning to act independently from her mind. She stepped back and steadied herself beside the console. What was it about this species, about this individual, that disrupted her equilibrium? The data would need to be reviewed again. Quietly. Thoroughly. Perhaps there were historical records of such interactions buried in the Alliance's interspecies health logs. Maybe buried for a reason. Emotional transference through biological stimuli was not unheard of. On her homeworld, Varelians used scent and skin conductivity as the basis of romantic selection, often before a single word was exchanged. Could this be something similar? Could human pheromones interact with Varelian skin in a way she hadn't anticipated? Or worse, could her own biochemistry have interpreted his unconscious hormonal signals as something more than just autonomic output? She shook the thought away and turned her attention to the chamber logs. Time of incident. Duration of elevated response. Recovery time. She typed with clinical detachment, though her body felt anything but detached. Her heart beat faster than it should have. Her skin felt charged in a way that was both alien and uncomfortable. She logged her findings under restricted access and locked the file behind a double-layer biometric seal. She would review it again later when she could trust her thoughts. When her skin returned to its natural color. When the strange ache in her chest stopped pulsing in rhythm with the heartbeat of the man asleep in her care. Until then, she would observe. Not just him, but herself. Something had shifted in the sterile stillness of the ward. Something that couldn't be measured by machines. Something that made Mars feel a little less cold. The next Martian rotation cycle brought with it a series of minor system malfunctions across Mars Medical Outpost K-9. Nothing critical, just a few flickering biometric monitors, one corridor's artificial gravity momentarily spiking, and a temporary drop in environmental humidity across the rehabilitation wing. The outpost's automated diagnostics flagged them all, patched them quickly, and filed the anomalies under routine orbital drift interference. Nothing warranted human or alien intervention beyond a cursory glance. Nurse Solari, however, had noticed a different kind of anomaly, one not confined to circuitry or climate control. It was internal, personal. She had spent the last 3 cycles carefully monitoring Lieutenant Hale's recovery, updating his vitals, and adjusting treatment as needed. He was healing faster than projected. Too fast, if she was being honest. Tissue regrowth had exceeded the upper limits of expected human regeneration. His bruising had faded entirely. Bone alignment was flawless. Neural response time had normalized after just 1 recalibration. And yet, beneath that tidy collection of biological success, there remained one stubborn inconsistency. The vascular surges continued. Not constant, sporadic. Seemingly random, but always isolated to the same region. Always accompanied by mild increases in skin temperature, heart rate elevation, and faint limb twitching. What puzzled her was that they often occurred in response to non-contact stimuli. Proximity alone appeared to be a factor. She had documented 3 separate incidents where Hale's readings spiked the moment she entered the room, even without initiating any procedure. Each time, the monitor flagged it as an endocrine anomaly, testosterone flare, paired with adrenaline priming and a spike in dopamine. He remained unconscious throughout, yet his body reacted to her presence like a flame reaching for oxygen. She had tried everything to rationalize it. She recalibrated the bioshell, adjusted nutrient flow, and even tested for environmental contaminants that could act as chemical stimulants. Nothing. Every control variable was clean. Every system baseline matched protocol. Yet, each time she approached him, the same pattern emerged. Something biological. Something reactive. Something undeniably tied to her. Now, as she stood over him again, her fingers paused midair before applying the neural gel. She was hesitant, not from fear of error, but from the now familiar anticipation that had begun to creep into her every movement. This time, the protocol called for a deep scan of the pelvic nerve network, standard procedure following prolonged muscular tension in the groin and thigh regions. In humans, these nerves were linked to both voluntary motion and involuntary arousal states. The scan was non-invasive, automated. Still, she hesitated longer than necessary before initiating it. The pod lights dimmed slightly, adjusting for sensor clarity. The machine hummed softly, passing a curtain of invisible waves over Hale's lower torso. Almost immediately, the readouts began to pulse in irregular rhythm. The screen bloomed with heat signatures. The vascular tissue expanded again. Blood flow surged. His respiration increased by several beats per minute. His facial muscles tensed, then relaxed. One hand curled into a fist. One leg twitched. Solari leaned forward slightly, watching the data scroll past. Then, without warning, the neuromuscular inhibitor field failed. A soft chime sounded a system error. One of the less critical subsystems had auto-disabled due to a voltage discrepancy in the medbay's central junction. The shield that had kept his lower body in a stasis-like state was no longer active. The full biological reaction began within seconds. Solari stepped back, instinctively, her skin flushing with an electric ripple of violet. She recognized the pattern now, both in his body and her own. The response was not one of trauma or fear. It was arousal. Clear, measurable, and increasingly mutual. Her hands trembled slightly, not out of weakness, but from something closer to confusion. Varelians were not strangers to physical stimuli, but their physiology had evolved along entirely different pathways. Their courtship rituals were slow, symbolic, requiring weeks of chromatic exchanges, shared pheromone trials, and reciprocal scent bonding. Physical touch did not trigger sexual response without a prolonged emotional exchange. Her people required cognitive intimacy before any physiological signal would activate. But humans, it seemed, were built differently. He was unconscious, yes, but not unaware. His subconscious was engaged, his mind swimming in layered neural activity, dreamlike patterns with distinct emotional tags. The EEG showed flashes of pleasure centers firing in waves. Whatever his body was experiencing, his mind was complicit. Solari took a long, slow breath and tried to center herself. Her fingers hovered over the console. She needed to act. This wasn't a crisis. Not in the traditional sense, but it was certainly a deviation from protocol. The Interplanetary Health Accord allowed for biological irregularities to be noted, observed, and, in rare cases, studied under the exception clause for unique species interactions. If she documented this fully, it would open a chain of administrative reviews and likely strip her of direct care over the patient. Another nurse would be assigned, likely one without her sensitivity, one who wouldn't see the beauty beneath the confusion. Because that's what this had become. Confusing, yes, but also fascinating. Compelling. The rhythms of his body had begun to echo in her own. Her skin's ambient temperature had risen by 3 degrees. Her pulse had increased, though she hadn't moved in minutes. And in the quiet center of her chest, something fragile and entirely unwelcome had taken root: anticipation. Not desire, not yet, but something shaped like it. A ghost of curiosity. A chemical craving for understanding. She deactivated the pelvic scan, cleared the visible heat signatures from the display, and reapplied the inhibitor manually, this time with a reinforced field directly drawn from the emergency circuit. The reaction stopped within seconds, the swelling subsiding, the vascular activity slowing until it returned to baseline. Hale's face relaxed again. His vitals evened out. The storm passed, but not inside her. She stood still for several moments, her gaze fixed on his now quiet form. The air in the chamber felt warmer than it should. The light dimmer, the silence deeper, as if something had passed between them despite the absence of words, movement, or shared awareness. A silent transmission encoded in touch, proximity, biology. She turned and exited the chamber without logging the event. This time, she didn't want the system's cold algorithms reducing what had just occurred to a line of sterile numbers. Because for the first time since she had arrived on Mars, something had happened that couldn't be explained by protocol. Something that made her feel alive. The artificial dawn aboard Mars Medical Outpost K-9 came not with the light of a rising sun, but with the slow shift in corridor illumination from soft cobalt to clinical white. Outside, the red planet remained still beneath a skeletal veil of upper atmosphere dust storms, their movement only faintly registering through seismic readings and orbital telemetry. But inside the station, subtler storms were forming, unseen, unmeasured, and far more intimate. In Recovery Chamber 12, Lieutenant Jason Hale stirred for the first time since arriving at the outpost. His eyes moved beneath closed lids, small flickers of dream state, rapid eye movement fluttering behind them. Neuroactivity was spiking. Reflex pathways were reigniting. His fingers twitched once, then again. Across his muscular frame, a cascade of muscle memory returned, clumsy at first, but growing stronger. His body remembered pain, pressure, entanglement beneath heavy metal beams. But it also remembered something warmer. A scent, a hand, cool skin that glowed in the dark. He could not name it, not yet, but it was there. Nurse Solari stood at her console just outside the chamber, reviewing vitals that had gone from anomalous to simply confounding. Hale's recovery had not only stabilized, it had accelerated. His skeletal muscle density had improved. Scar tissue was nearly non-existent. Brain function showed no signs of trauma. He was, by every metric, regenerating at an elite rate far exceeding his original pre-accident baseline. But what truly held her attention was the way his biosignature had begun to sync subtly with her own. Not mechanically, not consciously, organically. It was in the small things. When she entered the room, his pulse would increase by half a beat. When she adjusted the pod's climate, his skin temperature would respond within seconds. When her own coloration shifted, however slightly, his nervous system echoed the chemical markers of engagement. It was not mating behavior as her species understood it. Not even bonding yet. But it was alignment. The beginning of biocompatibility, and it had not been initiated deliberately. On the console, a medical advisory pinged. The chamber's oxygen levels were declining, not dangerously, but at a rate inconsistent with the pod's automated supply protocol. She moved to investigate, only to find the atmospheric regulator operating at partial power. The vent grid pulsed with a dim green light, indicating internal obstruction. The air quality remained breathable, but thinner than ideal. She ran a recalibration subroutine while simultaneously checking the main feed standard procedure. But as she leaned closer, the pod behind her hissed with decompression. Hale's eyelids fluttered open. The process was gradual, slowed by residual sedatives and atmospheric inconsistencies, but definite. His pupils dilated, jaw clenched. His eyes adjusted slowly to the overhead lighting. His gaze wandered, then fixed groggily on the movement in his peripheral vision. Solari noticed too late. The pod's biometric lock had registered his consciousness spike as recovery clearance and initiated the wake sequence. He attempted to sit, instinct overriding clarity. His limbs barely obeyed. Muscles spasmed. Chest rose with the first deep, unassisted breath he had taken in 3 days. The oxygen-deprived air hit him like a brick. His heartbeat jumped to dangerous levels, and his body, not yet used to the shift in pressure or the proximity of another biological form, reacted with a cascade of instinctual systems firing in rapid succession. His groin reacted first. The same reaction Solari had observed twice before, once during regenerative gel application and again during a routine scan, manifested with even greater intensity. But this time it wasn't hidden beneath inhibitors or concealed by unconsciousness. It was visible, obvious, and immediate. Solari froze. The chamber's gravity, though partial, was more than enough to lend weight to the moment. Her eyes locked onto the clear evidence of human arousal, the vascular pressure rising with clinical precision but psychological complexity. She could feel her skin pulse with a soft flush, neither defensive nor shy, simply reactive. It was instinctual on her part as well, an autonomic chromatic response not to threat but to unexpected stimuli. And then the air thinned further. The obstruction in the vent grid had worsened. A sudden pressure drop hissed through the chamber. Lights dimmed slightly. A low, rhythmic chime began, a warning. Atmospheric levels were approaching mild hypoxia. Hale inhaled sharply, then coughed, still disoriented, his lungs struggling to adjust to the change in density. Solari moved fast, pulling a rebreather from the emergency maggot and fitting it over his face. His eyes fluttered again, this time out of recognition, not just confusion. He focused on her. Her features. Her glowing skin. She moved around the pod swiftly, adjusting airflow manually with precision and grace, trying not to let her mind drift toward what had been revealed in that first waking moment. Her heart beat too fast, her own blood enriched with a small burst of endorphins not linked to stress. Somewhere in the cross-species entanglement of chemical signals, emotional residue had formed. It clung to the inside of her ribcage like fog refusing to dissipate. Jason Hale's vitals settled. His breathing slowed, but his body remained fully engaged. The arousal did not subside. Not even with the oxygen mask in place, not even under the temperature regulation field Solari reactivated. His body remained locked in a pattern of biochemical insistence. There was no danger in it, no aggression, only a very human stubbornness written in muscle and heat. Solari kept her hands busy, checking readouts, monitoring intravenous balance, adjusting electrolyte saturation. But her eyes kept drifting back. Once, twice. Each time, her skin shifted ever so slightly, the pale blue giving way to the lavender hue her species associated with elevated attention and, though she hated to admit it, mild attraction. The station's central systems restored airflow minutes later. The vent obstruction, later attributed to a microfiltration coil collapse, was cleared. The warning light vanished. Oxygen levels stabilized. The crisis passed. And yet, inside Recovery Chamber 12, the air remained charged with something heavier than carbon dioxide or ozone, a tension unaccounted for by monitors or systems. As Jason Hale slipped back into light sedation, his body finally easing into rest, Solari stood motionless beside him. She said nothing, did nothing, but the gentle shift in her glow told a story of its own. Not everything on Mars was measured in dust and data. Some anomalies lived between heartbeats, between breaths, between the space where one species' physiology ended and another's curiosity began. The recovery chamber remained in dimmed rotation mode, its ambient lighting mimicking the deeper blues of a Terran evening. Though Mars itself offered no such palette through its ruddy, dust-choked skies, the medical outpost adhered to circadian principles drawn from Earth's long biological history. Within its steel walls, the illusion of night pressed gently upon the ward. Machines softened their tones. Monitors displayed data in night contrast hues. Even the low hum of atmospheric processors seemed to murmur more than hum. Inside Recovery Chamber 12, the silence had shifted again, not with alarms or system errors this time, but with the slow accumulation of awareness. Jason Hale was awake, not groggily blinking through sedative fog as before, but lucid, observant, breathing in full, regular rhythms. His body, after days of enforced stillness, moved with care, drawing on returning strength. His injuries had been minimalized by advanced meditech, his vitals optimized by intervention. Yet what he noticed first was not his own condition, but the presence beside him. Nurse Solari stood at her usual station. Her posture was relaxed, almost statue-like, but her focus was anything but still. Her eyes monitored the overlays, but her awareness extended beyond numbers and pulse readouts. She could feel his gaze, see it even in her periphery. The patterns of attention were visible in her world, not sensed in mystery, but read through calibrated shifts in bioluminescence and thermal imprint. He was watching her, and unlike the unconscious micro-reactions of earlier cycles, this one carried intentionality. He was assessing her, not with suspicion or confusion, but with something more complicated. There was curiosity in his posture, interest in the small ways he tracked her movements. His physiology registered a controlled elevation, nothing like the unpredictable spikes from before. This one was quiet, sustained, measured, as though his body was beginning to anticipate her proximity as something desirable. Solari, for her part, maintained professional rhythm. She reviewed the regeneration maps, refreshed his hydration cycle, and checked the nutrient uptake algorithm, all motions done 100 times over, but this time performed with an unshakable awareness of the air between them. It felt denser, as though gravity had subtly increased. And perhaps, in a way, it had. The outpost's low-gravity system was under revision. A temporary fluctuation caused by recalibration had taken effect across the ward, lowering the gravity to 0.7 Earth standard. The change wasn't immediately obvious, no floating instruments or drifting medical pads, but the body registered it nonetheless. Blood flowed differently. Joints relaxed. Physical contact became more intimate by default. Less weight to buffer between bodies. Less resistance to subtle shifts in stance, balance, movement. Solari moved to assist Hale into a sitting position as part of his mobility reintroduction protocol. He responded well, better than expected, with muscular coordination returning in fluid intervals. But the moment her hands made contact, one at his upper back, the other under his forearm, the reaction was immediate. His skin, warmer than hers by nature, registered her touch like a thermal surge. Not painful, not even surprising, but intense. Their eyes met. Not for long, not dramatically. Just a moment, but enough to acknowledge what passed between them was no longer theoretical. No longer a one-sided curiosity or a misread hormonal spike. The data had been correct, but incomplete, because what neither monitor nor neural scan could measure was compatibility. Not just biochemical, not just physical. It was in their breathing, in the way their heart rates began to sink again, not in stress or fear, but in comfort, anticipation, in the slight dilation of his pupils. In the faint violet undertone returning to her glow, an echo of the first day she'd seen him react beneath her hands. She noted the shift but didn't log it. Instead, she activated the dual occupancy recovery cocoon for stabilization. It was standard procedure when a patient needed assisted mobility in low gravity. The cocoon's structure folded out from the wall like a second skin, a shared enclosure designed to encourage warmth, balance, and physical support. Originally designed for high-injury burn patients on Venus orbit, the cocoon used adaptive gel layers and temperature control to simulate soothing embrace. Within it, proximity was not just expected, it was required. Solari positioned herself beside him within the cocoon's central shell. The polymer membrane sealed gently around them, engaging the internal circulatory loop and light gravity simulation. Their bodies adjusted to the space, warm, close, pulsing with low rhythmic currents designed to relax musculature and ease tension. It was intimate by design, but it became something more through their stillness. Neither moved beyond necessity. Neither spoke, but their proximity carried weight. She could feel the rise and fall of his chest, the subtle alignment of their bodies through the gel's pressure mapping. Their skin didn't touch directly, yet it felt as though it did. Warmth diffused. Biochemical traces whispered between layers. Her breath slowed. So did his. Their shared oxygen supply grew more efficient as their breathing fell into unity. For the first time since arriving on Mars, Solari didn't feel like an observer in a human world. She felt present, involved. Not clinically, not experimentally, but biologically. Emotionally. Her skin lit with a glow she didn't bother masking this time. Pale lavender with deeper streaks down her collar and shoulders. Her people would have called it invitation. She didn't yet understand what he would call it, but his body's answer was unmistakable. A low pulse of energy moved through the cocoon, a therapeutic rhythm that mimicked the pulse of a calm heart. But theirs were already matching. Her chromatic bands pulsed once. His hand twitched gently, unconsciously seeking movement. The gesture was incomplete, restrained, but not empty. No data file could explain what was forming. No standard recovery metric could categorize this level of interspecies synchrony. The cocoon wasn't a vessel of therapy anymore. It had become a cradle of emergence, holding something that neither of them fully understood, but both of them now felt. By the time the cocoon sequence completed and the outer shell unsealed, the chamber lights had shifted to pre-dawn white. Hale's vitals were optimal. His mental clarity returned. Solari's pulse remained elevated but steady. She stepped out first, eyes neutral, posture composed. But she did not erase the shared data this time. She simply filed it under restricted review and left the chamber, knowing the system might one day ask what occurred between two biologically different beings inside a low-gravity cocoon on Mars. She wouldn't have the words, only the memory. The final rotation of Mars Medical Outpost K9's current cycle began like any other, with a system sweep, a gravity recalibration pulse, and a nutrient distribution drone hum drifting faintly through the outer hallways. But inside Recovery Chamber 12, the routine no longer felt like protocol. It felt like aftermath. Lieutenant Jason Hale sat upright now, fully lucid, legs extended before him atop the pod's cushioning surface. His vitals had stabilized to their ideal state and held there for a sustained period. Muscle elasticity had fully returned. He exhibited no residual neural trauma. The only anomaly remaining in his chart was non-medical. An intermittent synchronization in biorhythms with Nurse Solari that could not be explained by species overlap, shared environment, or proximity alone. Solari stood beside the chamber console, hands steady, her expression composed but distant. Her skin held a resting hue of pale blue now, but under the surface, she still carried a residue from the night prior. The cocoon session had ended with no breach of conduct, no contact that violated station protocol. And yet, something had changed subtly but irreversibly. She had felt it in the silence that followed their separation, in the way her senses still registered the echo of his warmth. Her bioluminescence had dimmed by regulation, but internally, her electrochemical balance remained elevated. Her internal diagnostics had registered the shift. Her instincts had confirmed what her training could not. Jason Hale was not just a patient anymore. He was a variable, presence, a source of resonance, of reaction. Her own body had begun to identify his as safe, compatible, and, if left uncorrected, attractive. The implication was profound. In Varelian biology, sustained resonance marked the beginning of psychological imprinting. Not always romantic, not necessarily permanent, but meaningful. She had not logged the full details. Not yet. Only partial biometric data from the cocoon session, paired with neutralized observations about recovery speed and mutual thermoregulation response. The rest, the color shifts, the sustained eye contact, the charged stillness, remained filed under unprocessed memory. Not out of shame, but uncertainty. She did not know what to name what had occurred. There was no precedent, no code for emerging cross-species alignment built on quiet proximity and unspoken understanding. Hale responded to her now with ease, watching her as she worked, reacting to small changes in her body language, the cadence of her movements. He no longer winced when she touched his arm to apply stimulants or pressed a diagnostic pad to his chest. His body registered her presence not with tension, but with calm. She saw it in his breathing, in the subtle dips and rises of his pulse when she moved near. And though he said nothing, protocol still requiring minimal speech until full respiratory clearance, his body spoke fluently in silence. There had been no further incidents of involuntary arousal since the cocoon session, at least none that registered medically. The swelling episodes had ceased, vascular pressure normalized, but what replaced it was something steadier, deeper, an undercurrent of readiness, held in check not by sedation or inhibitors, but by awareness, by restraint, by mutual understanding that neither could define what came next. Solari had prepared her final recovery notes, flagged the completion of Phase 3 healing, and submitted Hale's file for review by the oncoming shift's medical officer. Normally, this would be the moment her assignment ended. The patient would be reassigned for mobility reconditioning and psychological evaluation. She would move on to the next critical case. But she found herself lingering in the chamber, not from hesitation, but reluctance. The pod retracted slowly into standby position. Hale eased himself down, preparing for transport. The wheelchair drone activated, humming softly as it rolled toward his side. He looked toward Solari once more. His gaze did not ask a question, nor did it suggest expectation, but it acknowledged her, not just as the one who had healed him, but as someone who had shared something outside the reach of standard care. She logged one final note, encrypted under her personal authorization: patient's neurological and physical recovery complete. No residual trauma. Recommend ongoing cross-species observation due to emerging biorhythmic synchrony and emotional stabilizing effect. Further contact optional but not contraindicated. The language was clinical, cautious, but beneath it, meaning flickered. Outside the chamber, the shift changed. Lights adjusted. A new nurse entered the wing, her steps soft, uniform crisp, eyes already scanning her assignment. Solari stepped back to make room, posture immaculate. Her time was up. The transition was clean, but something invisible tethered her to the space. An imprint in the air, like warmth left behind in an empty bed. She exited the ward without ceremony, her glow fading to regulation levels, her steps silent down the corridor. Hours later, the outpost received a personnel request through internal systems. A Varelian nurse, specializing in interspecies medicine, requested reassignment to Earth Sector patient psychological research, citing recent observations and personal resonance data. The request was marked low priority, non-emergency. It was quietly approved. Jason Hale remained in Outpost K-9 for another week, monitored, evaluated, and eventually cleared for return to surface duty. His psychological assessments came back with no anomalies, save one flagged line in his final journal log. Subject responded positively to proximity during healing. Presence of assigned medical staff correlated with improved neurochemical balance. Recommend re-exposure for long-term study. The file was stored in the outpost's medical archives under restricted access. Not deleted, not forgotten, just shelved for now. Mars, for all its desolate dust and clinical machinery, had become the backdrop of something more than survival. In a place where air was borrowed and touch was filtered through layers of regulation, two beings had found something rare. Not a protocol, not an outcome, but the beginning of a question neither of them had yet answered.